The best way to learn Next.js is to simply build a project. So in this video, we're going to build this very simple project from absolute scratch so you can learn all about the latest features in Next.js, which include server components, server actions, suspense and streaming, static and dynamic rendering, and all of those buzzwords that you'll hear around Next.js. I added them all here to this one very simple project. It just has a home page here, and then here we have a posts page, which just lists a bunch of posts. I can click on one of them and it will open up the individual post page. We're going to add some simple styling here with Tailwind CSS. We'll also talk about that. And we're even going to add some authentication, because here I have create post as a page as well, but only logged in users should be able to create a post. So I protected this. My favorite solution for authentication, which is Kinde. So Kinde is the sponsor of this video. I'm a brand ambassador for Kinde, which is a paid sponsorship, but I think it's a great solution for authentication. So here, if I click on continue with GitHub, I can log myself in and I'm going to be redirected. Yeah, so now I'm redirected here to create post, fill out some form, right? So just a very simple form. We're going to use a server action here, as it's called. We're also going to work with data. So initially here in posts, we're going to fetch data from some external API, but then we're going to add our own database and we're going to get the data from our own database, right? So here I was just testing a little bit, but we can add more posts there. So if I would say, hello, blah, blah. Now, if I submit here and if I go back to posts, it's going to get hello here from our database, right? So reading and writing from our database, we can do all of that in Next.js as well, right? So then here I can click on hello and I can see the body as well, right? With a dynamic route, as it's called. If you don't know anything about databases, don't worry, I'll explain everything as we go, right? So this is the Next.js app router before we had the pages router. And we're going to use all of the latest technologies like TypeScript, Tailwind CSS. We're going to use Prisma to connect to our database. We're going to deploy to Vercel. We're using Kinde for authentication, right? So really modern stack for modern websites and web apps. This is, in my view, the future of web development. So we're going to build this from absolute scratch. This is the best way to get started with Next.js. Now, to really understand Next.js, you have to zoom out a little bit. So Next.js has both a client side as well as a server side, right? So this entire thing here is actually just one Next.js application. So as we build that project, I'll show you how it all fits together, right? So we're going to have client components, server components. I'll explain why we even want to use server components. We also have something called server actions. This is actually a huge innovation. A lot of people are talking about server components. In my view, these server actions are maybe even the biggest innovation, because they are sort of replacing your traditional API route handlers, right? So traditionally you would create an API endpoint, but these days you probably want to use server actions. Right now, they still exist, and we'll talk about when you want to use these, mostly for webhooks, but we'll get to that as we go through the project. So let's actually get started. Now, I recommend that you code along with me if you really want to learn Next.js. All right, so I just opened up my code editor. I don't have any folder open right now, so I'm going to create a new folder for this project, and I will call that something like Next.js first project. And then I need to open this up in Visual Studio Code. By the way, I will also put the final code of this project in the description below. So if you get stuck, you can take a look at the final code. That folder doesn't have any files right now. So let's actually create a Next.js application by opening up the terminal. And here we can write npx create next app. And then we need to decide which version. So I'm going to use a specific version in this video. If you want to follow along exactly with me, you may want to use the same version, but Next.js continues to improve. So by the time you're watching this, there may be a newer version which you may want to use instead. It may also be safer in terms of security. If you want to get the latest version, you can just write at latest, right? But if you want to follow along exactly, this is the version I'm using here. And then what you also may want to do is add a period at the end, because I already opened up this project on my computer. I don't want to create a new folder for my project. I want all the code directly in this folder. So then I can press enter. It's going to guide you through a setup wizard here. So we want to use TypeScript, ESLint, Tailwind CSS. I like to use the source directory, and we want to use the app router. We don't want to customize the import alias at the no. All right, so it's going to install the dependencies as well. May take a couple of seconds. All right, so after some time that is finished, let's actually see what we get. So you will see a lot of loose files here that are not in some folder. So this is typically for so-called configuration files. In the world of JavaScript, it always looks a little bit messy, because typically you have a lot of configuration files. Usually you have one for each tool that you are using. So with that create next app that we just used, you are automatically using certain tools. For example, for ESLint, we have this configuration file. We have gitignore because it also immediately creates a Git repo. We have Tailwind configuration here. And then we also have a bunch of folders here. So node modules is for the dependencies. Public is where you store static assets like your images. And then the source directory, because I picked yes in that setup wizard for source. And then directly in there, we have an app directory. Right? So we're using the app router. Previously, we had the pages router. So in there, we have some special files. So a page.tsx file has a certain meaning. So this means that there's going to be a page directly in the root. So basically the home page. This is what will be served when you go to the home page. So let's actually try that out. Let's open up our terminal here. Let's run our app. We can do that with npm run dev. How do I know that? Well, in the package.json file, you can see the scripts that you also get. So here we get a dev script, which will run a development server. In production, if you want to create an optimized version of the project, we would run npm run build. We'll take a look at that a bit later. Let's start off with a development server here. All right, so you can see it's going to start up our project here on localhost 3000. So let's actually go there. I'm actually just going to refresh. I already had it open here. All right, so then we get this. What we see here is the homepage, right? Because we're just at the root, or basically /. And so Next.js knows, hey, you're at the root. So I'm going to serve you this page file that you have directly here in the root of the app directory, right? So this page file is being displayed here. Now, of course, we don't want this. So typically one of the first things you're going to do is just remove a whole bunch of stuff actually. So here we can just go all the way to the bottom, and I'm just going to select everything here, and we can just get rid of that. I'm also going to delete the import statement here. And I'm actually also just going to delete all of the styling from Tailwind there. Let's actually just write home here so we can see something on the page. Now, if I save here and I go back, it should automatically update. Now, for some reason, it didn't do that. So sometimes I will just refresh, and now you can see, we see home here. Now you can see I have a black background here because my computer has dark mode as a default. So there is some default styling like that as well. And Tailwind is automatically set up in our project here to hook into that, right? So here you can see in the globals.css file, you can see we're getting some default styling here. So typically I also like to just remove all of this except the first three. So we want to keep the first three because we want to use Tailwind CSS. Tailwind needs these three to work properly. Right, so now we have a very simple app. Let me zoom in a little bit. So right now we just have the home page. So now we've seen the page, the CSS file. There is also a fav icon here. This is also a special file. So whatever you put as the fav icon in this file, that's what will be displayed or should be displayed here in the tab. I find sometimes it doesn't work properly with the fav icon, but that's okay. And here we have a layout file. So this is also a special file. This is essentially the root of your React component tree. Right, so you can see here we have the actual HTML and body tags. And then here we see something with children. So children is essentially going to be all the pages, right? So here we have one page, and it's essentially going to be sandwiched in here, right? So this page here, whatever you return from here, which is just main, this is essentially just going to be rendered inside of here, right? So this is what we have right now. So if I do this, we get the exact same result, except of course we don't want to write it like this. We want to have page specific code in a separate component. So that's what we have. Right, we'll talk more about this root layout as well. We also have some other things going on here, like the font. So I like using the Interfont. It's my favorite font. I think it's just a very good looking default font to have. So I will leave it like that. And you can see you need to apply it here with class name. And then we also have some metadata here. We'll talk about this in a second as well. All right, so what we have right now is just a home page. Right, so if you go to just the root or /, this is the page that's going to be served to you. Now, what if we also want to have something for when the user goes to /posts? Right, I wish I could zoom in here a little bit, but unfortunately it's going to be small. So what if we want to have something for when we go to /posts? Right, so right now we get some 404 error. This is actually also a default behavior by Next.js. So if we want to have something for /posts, we need to know how routing works in the app router. So it's all based on the folder structure. So here what we can do is I right click on app here. I say new folder. So here we can create a folder called posts. And then in there we can have another page file. Right? So this page will then be served for /posts because that's how I named the folder. Right? So page.tsx is a special name. Right? So then whatever component I'm exporting from, as a default from this page will be served for / whatever name you give the folder here. I can name this whatever I want. Let's just call it page. And let's use the main tag here. And here I can write posts page. Right, so let's see what we get. So now you can see I'm getting /posts. Right, and on the home page, I'm still getting home. Right, so now we have these two routes. We'll talk more about routing, but these are the fundamentals. Let's fill out our application a little bit. So if I go back to the example, you can see that the application has some default styling. So let's actually start there. So you can see it has a bit of a background color, and the text has a certain color, right? Some more global styles, you could say. So how do we do that? Well, those more global styles are appropriate to do in the layout because this is page specific, right? But something like a text color, I want it to be consistent across multiple pages, right? So here what we can do is on the body tag, we can use Tailwind CSS, right? And actually, it's a little bit tricky here always with inter.class name. So we have to create a template literal out of this. And then I'm going to interpolate this with a $sign and then curly braces. And then here I can have my other Tailwind classes. So for example, here I can specify the text color. Now, very quickly about Tailwind CSS. Tailwind has handpicked some built-in palettes for you. So for example, here on their documentation, I can see that if you actually just want plain gray, it's not called gray actually. It's called neutral. Everything above neutral here actually has a lot of blue in there. It's a bit of a design trick. You can add some blue into your grays. It looks a little bit better. I like to use either of these three color palettes, and lately I like zinc. So this will add a little bit of blue into your grays. It gives it a bit of a cooler look. If you want a warmer look, you may want to go for stone or something below here. Right, but let's actually stick to the zinc palette. So typically you also want to stick to that palette then also for background colors and other colors. So the way it works is you use text, and then if there is a color, you say zinc, and then which one out of this palette? Well, here, let's say it should be pretty dark. So the color should be some 800 perhaps or 900, right? And I have the Tailwind CSS extension installed. So I can hover this and it will tell me what it will actually apply in the CSS. Right, this is not a Tailwind CSS video, but I think this is still good to know. And what if I want to set some default background color for the entire project? Well, we can say BG, and then also we can pick a color. So let's stick to our zinc palette. And here we want to have 100. So it's not going to be plain white, right? Because plain white, it kind of hurts the eyes. So I want to make it a little bit of a different color. We'll use a bit of a bluish color. So now it's a little bit better, I think. So this has a bit of blue in there. Okay, let's go to the page file here and let's add an H1. Let's say welcome to my blog. And then here we'll just have some dummy text. So in my code editor, I can write lorem, and then I can write some number like 30. If I press tab, it will actually give me 30 words, right? So if I save here, let's see what we get. So now we have this. Let's actually style this a little bit better. I'm gonna place it next to each other. So for the H1, I'm gonna make it a little bit bigger. I'm gonna make the font bold, and I'll add some margin on the bottom. And actually we want to be responsive as well, including for the text actually. So we can have the text pretty big on wider screens. And then if the viewport gets smaller, so on a smaller device, it should become a little bit smaller, right? So here it becomes smaller. So how do you do that? Well, Tailwind is mobile first. It's always a little bit confusing, but basically it starts from a small viewport. And so whatever you specify here is going to apply for the small viewport. And then if you want something else on a bigger viewport, so from medium and up, we can say, well, it should be a little bit bigger on bigger viewports, right? So if you do this, it will be 4XL on a smaller viewport, but if it's a wider viewport, it's going to become bigger, right? A little bit tricky, but that's how it works. All right, now we also want this to sit in the center. So let's quickly do that here. We'll center the text. We'll add some padding to the top, and also horizontal padding. Okay. Now with paragraph text, I like to constrain the width. I don't want it to span the entire screen. So here I will say maximum width of 750 pixels. I will center it then as well. And I like to use leading here for the line height. Okay, so I think that looks pretty clean. And let's do the exact same for post as well. Right, so here we have posts page. Let's quickly duplicate this to the page, to the posts as well. So we will just add the same styling to the main. And let's see, it's just copy paste. And then for the H1, I'm just going to copy the entire H1. We could create a separate component out of that, but let's keep it a little bit simple. We'll say all posts. Okay, so now we also have some text here. We'll add the actual posts in a second. All right, so this is what we have so far. Now, if you look at the example, you can see we also have this header on the top and also a footer actually. And here we have a menu, right? So if I go to /posts, we still have the header, the same header here on top and also the same footer here. So let's continue with that. How do we get a header here? And then also a footer, but not just for this page, but on all pages. So the trick here is not really a trick, but remember this page file is just for that one specific page. If you want to do something that affects, well, everything in this case, all pages, you have to do it in this root layout, right? So remember this children here is essentially just going to be replaced with the pages, right? So you can also imagine that this is going to be like a page. So if you want something that's always going to be on top, like a header, I can add it right here. And if I want a footer here on the bottom, I can add it here, right? So let me actually go back to children, right? So this page, so now every page is going to be sandwiched in between a header and footer. So now if we go back, you can see I have header here and also footer here. If I go to /posts, let's see what we get. Yeah, so here I also have header and footer still, right? Now, of course, it doesn't look good. So let's actually make the header and footer look good. And let's create a separate component for them. So how do we do that? So I could create in the app directory a header.tsx file. So you can co-locate your components with the page and layout and so on. Now, in my view, it looks a bit messy. So what I like to do is outside the app folder. So what I like to do is I like to keep the app folder just for routing purposes, right? So here we have layout and page, and here we have a post folder. This is all essentially routing. I like to separate the components out of there into a separate components folder, right? So I'm doing this as a child of source, not as a child of app. So here I have a components folder, and this is where I would, for example, add the header.tsx file and also a footer file. So let me add a footer file as well. Okay, so let's quickly create a header component here, header. So let's see, what does it need to have? It needs to have a logo as well as a menu here, or just a nav here. So we'll create a header, and let's actually just write header here. We'll make it look good in a second. Let's just create these components. Same for footer. I will just create a footer component. Well, it will just say footer here initially. So now I want to use these components in that layout file, right? So then here now I would go here and I would replace this with the component we just created. I need to import it here as well as for the footer, right? So just import it here. And now every page is going to be sandwiched in between these two components. All right, so now you can see we still have that and here as well. So now, of course, we want to make it look good. So let's go to the header. Let's start it there. So what we want to have in the header is this image or logo essentially, and then also this nav menu. Okay, so here what we want to have a logo. So that's actually an image. We could use the image tag that we know from HTML, right? So we also have it in JSX. Now in Next.js, we have a special component for that, the next image component. And this will come with certain optimizations out of the box. So for example, it will do lazy loading. It can help you with the blur up effect. It can create optimized versions of your image, for example, WebP images. I have a separate video on this, but it's very powerful. So I like to use the image component. So you need to specify a couple of things. So here we have a source. So I have a image that I'm hosting on my server here. So let's actually quickly write the file path here. It's going to be bytegrad.com course assets, YouTube example logo.png. Okay, we also need to specify an alt prop here. This will be shown if the image cannot be loaded or if the user is using a screen reader. We'll just say logo. All right, now if you save here, you're gonna get an error. Yeah, so with an external image, right? So an image can be in two places. It can come from an external server, right? The bytegrad.com server in this case. You can also have it in your own public folder. If it were local, you don't need to do anything else, but since it's external here, we need to specify the width and height props. This is to prevent a layout shift. So I will just add something here just as a placeholder so we can get rid of the error. And then we get another issue actually. So since the Next.js image component will do some optimizations on your Next.js server, we don't want other people to hook into that. So we want to have some protection in place. So what we can do here, what we have to do here, we have to go to the next config file. And here we have to write images, remote patterns, and then we need to sort of allow this server to be used. Right, so here hostname should be bytegrad.com. Okay, now if you save here, I may need to restart the dev server. I find when you change something in the next config file, sometimes it breaks. Here I made a mistake. Yeah, so this should be without a colon. So now I actually have to restart the dev server. Let's see. All right, so now we have that image here. Okay, so we see the image. Now the image is a little bit too big. It should be smaller. The way it works is always a lot of people are confused by this. So the width and height is actually something you want to do after styling the image. So because it's more like an optimization. So you would still style your image to whatever size it should be. So for example, maybe I want this to be 35 pixels. Right? So I can just write width 35 pixels and the height as well. Right? Just styling it with CSS. And so CSS will now make it a little bit smaller, okay? And now as an optimization, I can also specify in the HTML, because this is all in CSS. CSS comes after the HTML is loaded. So the browser can see that there's going to be an image. So the way it works is the browser will first receive HTML. And the browser can see, oh, there's going to be an image. But it doesn't know yet how much space that image is going to take up, right? Because with class name, this is all CSS. That will be loaded after the HTML has been loaded, right? So what we want to do is in the HTML, we can already tell the browser how much space it's going to take up. And that's what we do here with width and height props, right? That's the only reason here, right? So now the browser can already see, the width and height is going to be 35 pixels. It can already reserve that space. All right, let's continue with this menu or nav. So here I can just use the nav tag, and in there we're going to have a list. Yeah, so it's always going to be quite a nested structure here, right? So we want to have something like this. Now, before I press tab here for my copilot, typically you're going to define your links or routes up here, and then you can map over them. It's just a little bit cleaner. It's more like the React way of doing things. So here we can say our nav links is going to be a list. So for each one, we can create an object here. So we can say this one is going to be for the homepage, so an href, and then what should we display? We just say home, and then the other one is going to be for /posts, and what do we want to display? Just posts, right? So here is where we define those routes. We'll add the other one that should be protected a little bit later. So for now, just these two. So then in here I can map over them, right? So then here I can say nav links dot map, and here I can just tab through, right? We're living in the age of AI programming. I don't have to type much. Right, link that label here, and then here I can just tab through. Okay, so now what we will get is we get these two. Now you can see I can't click on this yet. So here we are using li, but actually what we also want to add is an anchor tag, right? The goal here is to navigate. So in the li we want to have, well, we could write an anchor tag, but Next.js also has a special component for that called, well, link, right? So let me input this as well. So we want to wrap it in there, the label. So with this component, you're not making a hard navigation whenever you go to another page. This will be managed client side. So here we do need to specify the href. We'll say link.href. Okay, so now you can see I have this, and if I click on this, I'm navigated to /posts, right? So now we have a better way of navigating. Let's quickly style this up. Now I will go through the styling now pretty quickly because I don't want to waste too much time on styling here. So let's just quickly add some styles here. I'm going to go to the header here. We're going to use Flexbox. That's typically what you want to use when you have a layout issue. We're going to add space between them. We're going to center them vertically as well. I will add some padding vertically as well as horizontally. And I'll add a border on the bottom. I can just write border B, right? Very subtle border. Okay, so let's go to the list because they also need to have some styling. They should sit horizontally next to each other. So that's a layout issue. So we'll add flex. We'll add some horizontal space between them, and we'll make the text a little bit smaller. So let's actually make it 14 pixels. Let's also add some styling actually to this link. So that this will actually render an anchor tag in the HTML. We can just style that. So here we can say that the color should be, so we're gonna stick to our palette here, so zinc 400. We'll add active styling in a second. Now, one other thing I would like to do here as well, which is wrap the logo in a link as well, because I think people these days, they expect that if they click on the logo that they are going to the home page. So yeah, so here we'll add a link. We'll just wrap this entire image in a link. Now, if I click on the logo, I'm going to the home page. All right, so this looks better. And now you can see we have the same header on both pages. Let's quickly add some styling to the footer as well. So it should look like this. And what we have right now is this. Let's go to our footer file. So here we want to use the footer tag, footer, and then we want to have like a copyright statement. Now, actually, there's a special tag in HTML for that. And now we want to write the copyright symbol. Now, it's a little bit difficult to write that. So HTML actually helps us out. I have HTML entities. So they always start with an ampersand and end with a semicolon. And that's what will give us a symbol. We'll say 2030, all rights reserved. And then we will quickly add some styling here to the footer. Let's actually see what we get so far. Okay. All right. So here we have an interesting issue, which is we want to have a sticky footer, right? Very typical problem in web development. How do you make sure that a footer sticks at the bottom? Well, this is another layout issue. Whenever you have a layout issue, you want to use Flexbox like 95% of the time. Sometimes you want to use CSS Grid. Mostly it's Flexbox. So if we want to get this at the bottom, we can very easily do that with Flexbox. So with Flexbox, you need to make the parent element a so-called Flex container. So the parent element of this footer, well, we use the footer in here, right? So here the body is here, the parent element. So if I just make this flex, it will make it a flex container, but by default, they're all gonna sit on a row. We wanna keep that vertical flow. So we're gonna say flex col. Now we're back to what we had before. So you may say nothing has changed, but what we can do now is we can use margin. So we can say margin top auto, which will add as much space between itself and the other ones so that it will push itself to the bottom. Now here I just saved and it doesn't happen yet because the parent element should actually take up the entire height here. Right, so right now we just don't have enough content to stretch all the way to the bottom. So what we also want to add here is that the minimum height should be whatever is the viewport. Right, so if we do this, you can see it gets positioned all the way at the bottom. Okay, we'll center the text center. And we will de-emphasize the text a little bit by changing the color. Then we'll add some padding. And then what we will do is add a border on the top. Right, very simple border. Right, so what we have is this. All right, so this looks better, but what I still don't like is that it's stretching the entire width. So if you look at the example, you can see the width is constrained here, right? Because people's field of vision is centered more on the page, right? So it's kind of uncomfortable if a website stretches the entire width. At least that's what I think. So I like to constrain the width a little bit, and not just for here in the center, but everything, right? So also the header and footer, everything should be centered. So what we want to do is go to layout here, and ideally what we could have is some kind of container that can restrain the width of everything here, right? So let's actually write that down here. So we can have a container, and I'm gonna put everything in that container. The container will just make sure that there's like a maximum width. Right, now the container doesn't exist yet, so let's actually create a container component as well. I will do that right here, container.tsx, and let's quickly create a container. Right, very similar to what you may be used to from certain component libraries, like Bootstrap, for example. So we want to have a div essentially, and we're just going to give this a maximum width, right? So we're going to say maximum width of, let's say, 1100 pixels. And so whatever is going to be in the container, right here we have this stuff. We're going to get that as children, right? So with React, you get the children prop, and we're just going to push that in between here so that it's going to be restrained to that 1100 pixels. Right, so let's actually see what we get. So I do need to import it here. Let me import it, and now that error should be gone. Ah, yeah. So now you can see the width is indeed that maximum width, right? Now we do want to center it on the page, so we can say margin horizontally auto, which will center it. And actually we'll set the background color to white for that part. All right, so then we have some layout issues. So we want it to take up at least the height of the viewport. So here we actually also want to add minimum height screen. Right, minimum height screen. All right, and then we have that issue again with the sticky footer because now the parent element of this footer is different. Right, so the footer is now sitting in this container. So now this container is the parent element. So we'll use the same trick. We'll say flex. We want to keep the vertical flow. And then this is what we have. And then we can also remove that from the layout, right? So previously we were using this for the sticky footer. Now we can remove that. We'll also fix this width issue. So now you can see this is starting to look much better in my view. Just to quickly type the props here as well, right? So we can say colon, and we can do it inline here. Children is just gonna be some, what's called a React node. All right, now a little bit more here, by the way, in the layout file. We skipped over this, but the metadata is actually something you're gonna have to take a look at sometimes. Right now, what we see in the tab here is create next app, right? So typically you do wanna change at least the title, right? So this would be whatever you would like it to be. So we could say that these are my posts. I could add a description here. This would be picked up by other, for example, search engines. Google will take a look at your description, may also display the description in the search results. And if you just leave it like this will apply for the entire project. But you can also override this on an individual page. So if you want to have maybe an about page and you want to show about in the tab, well, you would do the same here, but then in that page.tsx file for about, right? And you would write about. All right, now let's actually work with the nav here. So what we would like to do is when I'm on /posts, that this also indicates that I'm on there. So here, what we would like to have is when I'm on posts here, that it actually has a darker color, right? That's what we want here. So that's very standard. That's pretty typical. So let's go to our header here. So here we are styling that. So here we have that link. So right now they always have this color, but when the URL has /posts, for example, it should have a darker color for the posts route. So we need to know what route we are on. So how do we get access to that here? Well, Next.js gives us a hook. It's called use path name. There are other ways, but this is one way of doing it. I'm importing it from Next Navigation. It will give us the path name of the URL that we are currently on. I can assign that to path name here. And now we get an interesting issue. So we are currently in a server component. We haven't really talked much about it because we didn't run into any issues with that yet. So in Next.js, everything by default is a server component, right? So even the components outside the app folder here, so in the components folder, these are all server components by default, right? So Next.js has two sides, essentially, a client side as well as a server side. Server components have a lot of benefits. So the server components, they run only on the server. So they render, which means running the statements inside their component function body, that runs only on the server. And that means we can do things like data fetching, as we'll see in a second. We can also keep a large dependency on the servers. We can do heavy computation and things like that on the server. And so there are benefits to that, and that's why it's the default in Next.js. Now, sometimes you want to do things like hook into a click event. So if I click on something, we want to do something, right? There's a click event in the browser, right? So in that case, you have to convert that component into a client component so you can hook into the event happening in the browser, right? Because then you need to run the code in the browser, right? So for your interactive components, as they're called, usually like a button or maybe an input field, right? Really where users interacting and when you're hooking into events is when you want to have a client component. Now in this case, what we have here is we want to read from the URL that the user is on. We want to do that just here in the browser. This is another situation where this should also become a client component. So we can do that by just adding use client to the top, which will make this component a client component. The error is gone now. And now it will give us the path name. Let me quickly log that so we can see what we get. I'm going to open up the console here. So here we are on home, and the path name is just / on /posts. When I click there, we get /posts, right? So this is what we get when we use that hook. And we can use that to change the style of the link, right? So here we are mapping over each link. So here we have them all. So we can check if the href that we're mapping over, if that is the same as the path name that we are currently on, we can change the color, right? So I want to run some logic here. So let's actually convert that to a template literal. So we need to add curly braces here as well, right? So then in here, I can run some logic. It's a bit clumsy, but bear with me. I'm going to press enter here. Yeah, so Copilot already knows what I want to do. So if the path name is the same as the link.href, And then what do we want to do? Well, do we want to make the font bold? No, we would just want to change the color. So we'll say text zinc 900. And otherwise we don't want to do anything. So if we do this, let's see if I refresh here, if I go to posts, no, it doesn't work yet. Yeah, so it may not work yet because first we're applying this one and later after that we're applying this. Now, due to the way that Tailwind CSS works, you may run into issues when you have a clash like this in the class names. So here, what we can actually just do is if there is no match, so if the path name is different from the href that we're mapping over, we want to get this zinc 400. So we can just make this part of the ternary here, right? That's what we want to add here, right? So now we always have either one or the other, so there's not like overlap. And now when we go back, you can see we get the result that we're looking for, right? So that looks right. So this is a common thing you want to do. Let's actually also quickly add a border on the sides of the container. I think it separates itself from the background a little bit better. So let's quickly do that. I'd go to the container here and I will just add a border. We just have to write border L and border R. And if we do that, we have a nice border here. Yeah, I think that looks a little bit cleaner. All right, so what we now want to do, of course, is when we go to posts, we should actually see some posts. So if we go to this page here, posts page, this one right here, right now we don't have a list, right? So what we want is a list and then an li for each, well, let's take a look, for each post. So what we can do these days to fetch data, we can do it directly in a server component. Right, so traditionally in a React feed app or client-side app, you would use useEffect. But these days we can do it directly here. We can mark this component as async, and I can just directly fetch data here. Right, so I can do await fetch. It will give me some response. We can parse the response. Right, so here we can say await response.json. So now we just need to know the URL of what to fetch. Right, so if I quickly show you this on the diagram, so I'm in a server component. Right, that's what a page component is by default. It's a server component. From here, I'm going to fetch data, right? So I could have a database, right? I could have my database right here. I could have a database right here, and I could get data from my server component from my database directly without useEffect or anything else, directly from a React component, which is a server component, which is pretty cool. So now typically you're not going to use fetch to actually get it from your database. You would use a so-called ORM, for example, Prisma or Mongoose or Drizzle. And you would do something like prisma.post.findMany, right? This is how you would get data from your database. So I found a online service, dummyjson.com, and we can just use that URL, right? So the data source is not going to be our own database. It's just going to be some other service online, but it works the same, right? So we're just going to get data from some data source. So in this case, I can actually use fetch, and the URL here will be dummyjson.com/posts. Now, I only want to get 10, so I can say limit is 10. Okay, so then we still won't see anything because we are not rendering anything here on the page. So then we get our data here. We can map over that. So it will be data.posts. We can map over that, okay? And actually I will use parentheses here so we can do it without the return keyword. So here I can accept the suggestion I'm getting from my copilot. So here we want to have an li that's correct, and I actually don't want to get the body. We just want to display the title of the post, right? So we're just going to have a list of titles here, and let's actually see what we get. So I'm going to save here and let's see what we get. All right, so now we have this list of titles. So it should be styled a little bit differently. So it shouldn't be in H2. I don't know why it got that. Actually, because it was a title. Now we actually want this to be a link. Let's actually make this an anchor tag in HTML. So what we want to do is, we'll talk about it in a second. We should be able to click on this, and then we should be able to view the body here, right? So this will be another route. We'll talk about that. But we need to navigate to that first. So what we want to navigate to, we'll have a template literal here. So it should be /posts, and then we want to get some ID, right? So we're going to add an ID here to the route, to the URL, very common as well. It's called a dynamic route. We'll talk about it in a second. So this should be the ID. So here we can say post.id. That's what we want to make part of the URL. We do need to import the link here. And now if I save here, let's see what we get. All right, so this looks a little bit better. And you can see I can now also click on this and navigate, but we don't have any matching page.tsx file yet for that particular route, right? So right now we just get an error. Okay, now it's sitting a little bit too low here. So I think the padding here should be reduced a little bit. Let's turn this into 16 instead of 32. So now, yeah, that looks a little bit better. I'm zoomed in here, so it looks a bit cramped, but this looks all right. Now we do want to reduce the margin between those items a little bit, so we'll make it margin bottom 3. All right, so that looks a little bit better. Right, so this is an example of getting data in the latest Next.js. You can do it directly here in the server component, which is very common, right? So just to give you some intuition of what to use all of this for. So server components, when it comes to data fetching and updating data. So server components is typically where you want to get data these days, right? Just directly in the component function body like this, whether it's with the fetch API or Prisma, right? You can, your ORM, you're getting data, right? You can do it directly in server component, no need for use effect. And then, as we'll see, if you want to do your traditional post, put, and delete requests, right? So basically updating data, traditionally you would use maybe an API endpoint. But as we're going to see, we'll talk about server actions in a second, you can use a server action for that. This may be completely new for you, but this is actually very powerful, as we'll see in a second. Now, what about those API endpoints? Do you still need those, or route handlers? Well, this is what you would use for so-called webhooks, right? So don't worry if you don't know what those are, but some of you will know. And it's, for example, if you're using Stripe and somebody makes a payment, the Stripe server will notify you, hey, somebody made a payment, right? So they will send a request to your server. You need to expose some endpoint for them. So that's still a good use case for these route handlers, right? But for all of those traditional getting data, you can do it in here. And then updating data, right? Fancy word, data mutations, basically your traditional post, put, and delete requests, you want to use a server action. More about that in a second. All right, so now what we want is when I click on here, it will actually add something to the URL, right? So now I wish I could zoom in here, but I have posts/1. And I'm gonna have other IDs in the URL as well, like 2 or 5 or 6. So we would like to display something when the URL is that as well. So we learned that if you want to do that, you need to use page.tsx and you need to use a folder structure to match for that part of the URL. Right, so if you just want /posts, it's easy because posts will always be just posts as a folder name. Now here's a little bit trickier because here we could have the number 1. So it doesn't mean I have to create a folder called 1. Right, so if I have number 1 here, I would like to display something. Right now we just get some standard 404 because we are not matching anything with that URL here. So if you want to have /posts and then you want to match something there, you have to again work with the folder structure here. Right, so now it comes after posts, so you need to create a folder in posts here. So it doesn't mean I have to create a folder actually called 1 because that's the part of the URL, right? So now I have to create 1, and then you could say, well, then we have the page.tsx, right, that we actually display. Let me actually quickly create a page like that. I will just call it page. So now I have page, and indeed we see page here. Now the problem is, of course, that we want to use the same component for these other IDs as well. So if I have the number 5, I would also like to use this component. So it doesn't mean that now I have to create another folder for, let's say, ID number 5 and maybe later number 8, number 2, 3, for potentially an unlimited amount of IDs. Right, and the good news is now we can just have one folder here and one page.tsx for all of them, but we have to make it a so-called dynamic route. So you use square brackets and then you can just give it a name. So here ID would be pretty typical. I need to update my imports, yes. And sometimes in Next.js it will then open up some file here in the .next folder. I'm just going to save here and close. Right, but now this page will be served for whatever number it's going to be. So if I make it number 10, you can see it's page. If I make it number 3, it's still page. Right, so that's a little bit more efficient. Right, so this is called a dynamic route. All right, and what do we want to display on a page like this? Let's go to the first one here. So here I want to show the title of the post and then also the body of the post. Right, so here what I want to display, let me close the sidebar here. So here what we want to do is main. We'll have an h1. This should be the title of the post and then just a paragraph. All right, so how do we get the title and the body of a post? Well, we're going to make another fetch call for that. Well, we can actually just fetch that again. So let's go back to our previous fetch call. And so here we were getting a list of them. Let's actually copy this because it's very similar if you want to get an individual one. So here I can just paste that right here. Now here we don't want to get a list. Now here I have to mark it as async because we're using await, right? It's a server component, so no problem. And then here we don't want to get all of them. We just want to get the post with a certain ID. So you just do posts. And let's actually try just getting the first one, let's just actually try getting the one with ID 1. And then here I get the data. So here I can then output that. I can actually also call it post. I think that makes a little bit more sense. Let's call it post. And then here I get post.title, and here I get post.body. So if I save here, you can see I get the title and the body, right? So it's making a fetch call for that. Okay, let's very quickly style this. I'm just gonna add some padding, and I will center the text. Okay, for the title, I will just quickly add some styling as well. Margin bottom of 7. All right, that looks better. And for this text, we want to restrict the width to 700 pixels. And we'll center it. Okay, so that should look better. Okay. All right, so now the problem is, of course, that no matter what ID is actually in the URL, if I do number 10, I get this. If I do number 5, I get this one. If I do number 2, I get the same one. So it's always the same now because we are always making the fetch call for ID number 1 to our data source. Right now, of course, if I'm on URL with a 2 in there, we should get the post with ID number 2 here. So we don't want to hard code number 1 here. Right, so let's make it a template literal. Let's remove number 1 here. We want to actually have the ID from the URL. How do we get access to that? Well, in a page component, you get sort of like a special prop. And in this case, we want to use params. Right, and then what you can use here is params.id in this case, because that's how we named it here in the folder structure with square brackets. Right, so we call it ID. So then if you want to access it, you take params and then whatever name you gave it. Right, so if we do this, you can see actually it already changes. Right, so here number 2, I get a different one. If I do number 5, I get a different one as well. Right, so now we actually are personalizing whatever is on the page based on what's in the URL, right? Now, it also means when I go back to that list, and if you click on one of them, it should actually display the correct one, right? So I think that looks pretty cool. Let's quickly type the props here. Let's just do it inline. It's a little bit faster. So params is an object actually, and it's gonna have an ID, which is a string. Right, it looks a bit clunky here always with the types, I think, but let's accept that. All right, let's talk a little bit more about another buzzword or buzzwords you're gonna hear, which is suspense and streaming. So if I go to the home page here, if I now just refresh and let's say I want to go to posts here, I'm gonna click right now. Now, if you click on posts here, you may notice a very slight delay, but it's still pretty fast because maybe you have a good internet connection, but some of your users are gonna have bad internet connection. So whenever you deal with a situation where you may have some latency, it's a good idea sometimes to just add a bit of additional time. So here what we could do is a way of quickly sleeping in JavaScript. So this is the page for posts, right? So here this is for the posts route. Here what I can do is just make this take a little bit longer because it's a little bit more realistic, and I want to show you why it's important. So here we make that fetch call, right? So here's, right, so just to add some delay here, I can just quickly do this. Looks a bit complicated here. It's just a way of sleeping in JavaScript. So basically, we're just gonna stop and wait here for 1 second before we continue to the other lines. So now if we do this, if I just refresh here, if I go to posts now, if I click on post, I just clicked and I'm waiting and waiting. And after 1 second, a little bit more, I finally get the result here. So this is a little bit more realistic. Now, the problem with this is that if I click now, you can see I don't see anything. I don't get any feedback while I clicked, right? So what we want is immediate feedback, right? So here I clicked and I have to wait like 1 second. So what we basically want to deal with is a loading state. So Next.js has some other special files as well. A common one that you may want to use is loading.tsx as well. So if I create a loading.tsx file at the same level as this page, whatever I'm exporting from here as a default component will be displayed. Right, so here I can just create a loading component, and here we can just say loading ... right? So as long as this page is loading, right, basically going through the statements here, there should be loading ... So now if I go here, let me refresh. If I go to post now, you can see I see loading ... And after that 1 second, a little bit more, we actually get what we want. Right, so now I get immediate feedback, which is a better user experience. Right? I could add some styling here to center it on the page as well. But I think you get the point that we are now able to show a loading indicator. So this is actually suspense and streaming. Next.js abstracts that away for you with this loading.tsx file. So when you create a loading.tsx file, what Next.js will actually do is wrap your page at the same level, right? So the post page in our example, with a suspense component actually. And then here there's a fallback, and that's whatever you put in that loading file. Right? And that will be displayed while the page is loading. Now, by the way, there's also some caching going on. Caching is very complex in Next.js. It's outside the scope of this video, but sometimes when you go back and forth, it will be very fast actually, and you won't see loading anymore because there's some caching, right? So if you want to bust that cache, you just reload the project, and now I will see loading ... again. All right, so now we have a nice loading state. There is only one downside, which is that the reason that we may be waiting for this page to load, maybe only because of this data fetch, right? Which we only need for this part. We don't need it for this h1, but this h1 right now is also sort of blocked while we're waiting for this data fetch to finish, right? So here now, if I go to posts, I don't even see the h1. I only see some general loading ... But it would be nice if we can already show the other parts on the page, right? We're waiting for this part of the page to load, but we should be able to already show the h1 so the user knows they're on the right page, right? So we can be a little bit more granular than just wrap the entire page in a suspense, which is what you do with loading. Instead, we can make it more granular so only this part is wrapped in a suspense. So to do that, we do need to create a separate component here. So I'm gonna add a new one here to the components file for that list of posts, right? So we're gonna say posts list singular, and here we'll say posts list. And then we will just copy all of this and paste that right here. Okay, now the data, and let's actually import a link component. Okay, now how do we get the data? So we're just going to make this fetch call, including this sleeping. We're just going to move this down into that posts list, right? So let's actually go here. We're going to move this down. We're going to mark this as async, still server component. So now we're just doing the data fetching in this component. So now in the page, we can remove it and we can replace all of that with that component, right? So just a little bit of refactoring here, bear with me, right? Nothing crazy going on, just a little bit of rewriting. But now we have this h1, and now we have this separate component in which we're actually doing the data fetching, okay? Now the benefit of this is that we can now wrap not the entire page in a suspense, but just this part that actually needs some time to finish, essentially. So what we can actually just do, we can now write suspense ourselves, right? So we can say suspense and just wrap it in there. We have to import this from React, and now we can display some fallback while it's loading, right? So I can just write loading ... again. We can actually remove the loading.tsx file. Let's actually do that. Let's remove it. So now let's actually see what we get. So now if I just refresh here, if I go to posts now, you can see that I get the h1 almost instantly. And then just for that list, we have the fallback, right? So now this is a little bit more granular. I think it's a better user experience. They immediately see the page on which they're on. Right, make sure you add the suspense. Don't add the suspense in here. Suspense needs to be essentially wrapping the actual data fetch. So don't add the suspense in here, which is kind of tempting to do so. It needs to be a little bit higher up, essentially, right? So it needs to actually wrap the data fetch, not sit below the data fetch. Okay, now when you click on any of these individual posts, for example, the third one, it may actually take some time, right? So now we have to wait again. We don't see any loading indicator because this is also fetching some data. It could take some time, right? So we may also want to do something like this for the individual posts, but I will leave that as a challenge to the viewer. All right, now very quickly, let's talk a little bit more about the server and client components. So far, all of the components essentially, except here in the nav bar, are server components. So most of these components are only running on the server because they don't really need any interactivity. So then when would you actually need that interactivity? So very typical things would be a button or maybe an input field, really when the user needs to do something, right? So for example, what we could have on a page like this is maybe an upvote button, right? So that the user can upvote an article or this post, let's say, right? So I can add an upvote here. Here I have an upvote button. I can quickly style this BG blue 500, text white, and let's quickly add some padding, P2. And let's also add some margin on the top. Okay, so now we have an upvote button here. And when the user clicks, maybe we want to keep track of some count, like how often they've upvoted it, right? Just a silly feature here, right? So we would want to keep track of the count, right? So that is useState, right? So here we would say upvote count, something like this, upvote count, set upvote count, and then we would use useState. And so here I'm using useState, and then when I click, I would like to increment that, right? So then here I would want to run a function on click, right? So hooking into a click event. Then I want to run this function, and the only thing I want to do here is just increment the upvote count by 1. Now, as soon as I save here, you're going to get into an issue. You're importing a component that needs useState. So this only works in client components. And right now, this page component is a server component. You can also see that because I'm using async here. This is only possible in server components at the time of recording, at least. You want to be very careful. So a beginner is very tempted to just add use client here to the top of the page. When you do this, the entire page component here becomes a client component and you lose all of the benefits of server components. You cannot do fetch like this in a client component. So you actually get a warning right now, and you lose all the other benefits from server components, like keeping large dependencies on the server, using secrets on the server side, interacting with your database on the server side. We'll talk more about that. So ideally, we can keep components a server component. So in this case, what you want to do is not just blindly add use client here to the top. You want to be very careful with that. So what you would want to do is, for example, what you would want to do here is actually create a separate component out of this. So here I could simply create a new component called upvote btn. Right? So here I just quickly create upvote btn, and then I will copy this entire button and I will just put it in here, right? And then the same for state. I will put that right here, right? Make sure we import useState here. I don't need this React import. That's just from this extension I'm using to quickly create a React component, right? I can do this because I'm installed an extension for that. And here is where we would add use client, right? Really to the outer edges of our component tree, right? So just this little component needs that. So now I can remove it from here. I'm not going to add use client so high up in the component trees to the point where it affects even the page. I'm going to add it to just upvote btn here, right? Which I can just import into this component. So now this can stay a server component. We get all of the benefits, and just this little component that actually needs that interactivity. When I say interactivity, I mean hooking into an event, right? So when I click here, there is a click event. So hopefully you paid attention to your JavaScript DOM lessons. When the user does things in the browser, there are events. So when I click here, there's a click event. We want to hook into that. That cannot happen on the server, right? So this is not happening. This is happening in the browser. So we have to run this component in the browser, right? So this on click or on change can only happen in the browser. So it needs to be a client component. Right, we could also add the upvote count here so we can actually see what the current count is. Right, so just a bit of a silly feature. You can add emojis and we can make this fancier. But the point here is that if you want to hook into events, or you want to use any React hook, whether it's useState, useEffect, useRef, all of those React hooks, they also only work on the client side. Right, so events, React hooks, and that includes the context API, by the way, right? So with the context API, we use context. We also use create context, right? So then we get more into fancy word state management, right? Because state management is essentially about keeping track of something. That can only happen in a browser. The server will not keep track of something. The server will just receive an incoming request and then just respond, and then just returns a response, and then it forgets about it, right? But the browser will be here. The browser will stay here for the entire time the user is interacting, so we can keep track of something. That's why all of the state management solutions, very fancy word, but it's basically just a context API and toStand and Redux as well. Those only work on the client side as well, right? So if you want to use any of these, you have to turn it into a client component. And typically you want to keep it at the edges of your component tree. So you want to refactor sometimes, right? But I would say a lot of the components, probably most components, can stay on the server side. Most components simply don't need interactivity. Right, so as we are seeing in our project, most of the components are actually server components, right? So they can just stay on the server. Now, when you render them, they will still have a result. And the result of that render is still sent to the browser so we can still see them, right? But that's different from a React Feed app, right? So in a React Feed app, all components are essentially client components. It's all client side, right? So that will take some time to get used to, but if you do a couple of projects, you will get it, right? This is just a silly example. I will delete it for now. We don't really need this. I will also remove it from here. Okay, let's see what we can do next. So here what we have is also another page, the create post page. Now I'm currently logged in so I can view this, but we're gonna protect this page with kind in a second. But first let's create this page. And what the user should be able to do on here is actually submit data, right? So right now what we did is we were getting data. We were using fetch to get some data. But in the real world, of course, you also want to submit data, either to create something new or to update something that's already existing or to delete something, right? So these are called the data mutations. And we want to use a server action for that. But before we get there, let's actually just create this page. So we need to add another item here in the nav. Let's go to our header. So let's go up here and just, right, so this is the benefit of doing it this way. Now, if you want to change it, it's very easy to manage all of these links. So we just want to create a new one, which will be create post. I will leave the second word lowercase. Okay, so now we have create post. So if we go there right now, we're going to get a 404 because we don't have any page.tsx file actually matching this part of the URL, right? So remember, if you actually want to serve some page for that URL, you need to work with the folder structure. So this time it is not inside /posts, right? So it's just its own route, you could say. So I'm going to create a folder as a direct child of app. I'm going to say it's create -post, and then in there we will have a page.tsx. Okay, so let's quickly export a page component from here. All right, so now you can see I have page here. Let's make this a main as well. I'm making this a main because it's sandwiched between a header and footer, right? So the header will give a header tag in the HTML, footer a footer. So then the page, which is essentially what these children are, will then be the main, right? The dominant content on the page. So here what we want to have is an H1, right? Create post. And then we actually want to have a form, right? So very often if you want to submit something, you're going to use a form. And we're just going to have something very basic. We'll just have one input and we'll just have a button that will just say submit. So let's actually copy the styles for the H1 from some other page. Let's just take this one. I'm just going to copy all the class names here from this one, and I will just paste that for this one. Okay, and let's actually center everything here. So we can say text center. I will add some padding to the top, 16. Okay, let's actually style the input because we don't even see it. So we should get a border. We will round it and we'll add some padding. And we'll actually make it take up the full height. Same for the button. We'll say H full, and we'll add a background color BG blue. So in this case, a different palette, but that's okay. Some padding and also rounded, and text should be white. All right, so then we can just set the height in one place. So in H10, we can add some space horizontally, some margin on the top of 10. Okay, let's add some other information here to the input. So it should be of type simply text. We need to give it a name so that later when we submit the form, we have a way of getting the data from this one particular input. We'll add a placeholder as well. We can call that title for, let's say, a new post, right? So we could have other inputs here, but let's stick to one. And we also can have some validation, very simple, just required. Right, so actually very simple form for now. We're gonna finish the form and the rest of the page, including server actions in a second. I just quickly want to get something up on the page. All right, now traditionally in React, what you would do is when the user fills out the form and clicks on submit, that's an event, and you would try to hook into that event, right? So you would do something like on submit in the form, right? And then you would have some function that you would run, and you would submit it to your backend, perhaps to insert it into the database, right? So you would do something like maybe a fetch call to maybe your API endpoint /posts. That would be a post method, right? Something like this. And you would grab the data from the form. You would grab the data from the form, and that's what you would send as the body, right? You would do something like this, and then on your backend, you would actually create this API endpoint with a route handler. Right? That was traditionally how you would do something like this. So these days we have something new. So instead of using onSubmit, you can use the action attribute. And what you specify here is actually just a function. So we can give it a name. We can just give it a name of a function. Let's call it createPost. And this will be a function that will only run on the server. So this is called a server action. I could define it in here, but I think it's a bit cleaner to separate them out into a separate file. So what I like to do is create a folder here in source called actions, and just one file here for a simple project, actions.ts. And here I can export a function called createPost. Let's actually do that. Right, so then I can import it here. Let's actually import it. Okay, so now the error is gone, but what we want to do here is we want to add use server at the top. Right, so use server is not to create a server component. It's to create a so-called server action, which is essentially just a JavaScript function, but it runs only on the server side. And it has some special features, right? So you can specify that as a value here for action. And so what will happen is now when the form gets submitted, Next.js will make sure that the data of the form is automatically submitted to this function here, essentially. It does need to be async. As you can see, then the error is gone. So we'll make it async. And so what we will get here is form data of type form data. And we can actually just log that to check that. So we can say form data. It's always a bit tricky to work with form data. So let me make it a little bit wider. So now I can grab the title from the form data. And let's actually log this to see what we get. Right, so this looks very strange, perhaps, if you've never worked with server actions and you're used to the traditional way of submitting data. This will look very strange. But what will happen here is I will now fill out, let's say, test here. And now if I actually submit the form, Next.js will make sure that this data here from the form in my browser is actually submitted to my server side, right? And I get access to it right here, just like a normal JavaScript function, essentially. And I can just work with the data like this. I don't have to spin up a whole separate API endpoint. I don't have to awkwardly make sure I get the correct URL here, right? So API post. I don't have to do anything like that. That has all been abstracted away from me. That whole network boundary is essentially abstracted away from me. Next.js will make sure I actually get the data here. So let's actually log that. Now, if you log something in Next.js, your intuition may be to open up the network tab here in the browser. But that's only if you log something on the client side. And remember, a server action is only running on the server, right? So if I show you this diagram again, here we have the Next.js client. This is running in the browser. Here we have the server. This is all running on the server side. So you can see with Next.js, it's more like a backend framework in a way. There's a lot of server-side features suddenly. Right? So if you want to submit data, create something new, typically you would create a post request, right? So that's what you use a server action for these days. So now if I want to see the log, I have to open up my terminal here actually, because this is where you'll see logs on the server side. So I'm going to submit now, and let's see what we get. I'm going to submit now. You can see I get the actual value logged here. So we now get access to the form data on the server side, and we don't even have to send the data from the browser to the server side ourselves. That's all handled for us, right? No need to create a whole separate API endpoint like maybe you were used to. Right, so here I'm just logging here. In the real world, what we would likely do here is actually update our database, right? So if you were using an ORM, I'm using Prisma here as an example, but could be Mongoose, could be Drizzle. You can also connect directly to your database. You don't even need an ORM. If you don't even know what an ORM is, don't worry. Basically, we want to update our data. That is typically what you use a server action for. right? So to update your data in the database, whether it's adding something new or updating something that already exists or even deleting something, that's typically what you use a server action for in the latest Next.js. Now for getting data, that is something you can do directly in the server component, right? So here we saw an example of using fetch because we're using this dummy json.com website. Now if we have a database, I can use Prisma again and I can just get my data like this, right? If I was using Prisma, right? So getting data, you can do it directly in the server component. And then for updating data, so fancy word is data mutations, you can use a server action. You now essentially just have a normal JavaScript function that you specify for the action attribute, and Next.js will make sure that the form data on submission is sent to that function. And we can actually see that because there still needs to be some network request, right? Because that's how browsers work, right? So if I go here and go to network, here we have our network requests. So if I do another test 2, if I click on submit here, you can see there is actually a fetch call here. I'm not making that fetch call. I didn't use fetch here somewhere. This is Next.js or React actually that's doing this for me behind the scenes, right? So this create post fetch call, I did not make this myself. This is what Next.js internally is managing for me. And you can also see that it's sending it to a particular URL, right? So it's actually the same URL as the page that you're using it on. So that will be create post. And it's actually a post request by default, right? So with a server action, you are essentially creating an API endpoint on your server, right? A post API endpoint on your server with the same location on which you're using it. But crossing that actual network boundary with an actual fetch call, that's all managed for you behind the scenes. That's why I think that's very powerful, right? So in the payload, there is some ID to identify that on the server. And the actual form data is also part of that request. So that's why we get access to this right here. Right, so uServer is not to create a server component. I see some people make that mistake. The default is already a server component, right? Components are by default already server components. You don't need to do anything extra. And in fact, when you use this directive, you are actually creating a server action, right? Those are two different things. A server action is actually just like a post API endpoint on your server. So you actually want to be a little bit careful with that as well. You also want to make sure that maybe only logged in users should be able to do this, right? So we're going to see how to protect this with Kinde in a second. So server actions, really powerful. I would say maybe even the biggest innovation because there is actually more to them as well. So if you want to, right? So when you submit something from the form, it may take some time before you get a response, right? So you want to show a loading indicator. So with these server actions, you also get some other hooks. So at the time of recording, we have something called useForm status, which will give you a pending state. There is also something called useForm state at the time of recording, which you can use for an error state because you also want to display errors in case something goes wrong on the server. There's also use optimistic, so you can have optimistic UI, very powerful. But eventually what we're going to have is the use action state hook. This will allow us to work with a pending state and an error state with just one hook. But at the time of recording, this isn't stable yet, so I can't show you that. But basically what it comes down to, it's integrated with other hooks that you also get to deal with some other states that you typically want to deal with, right? So for your traditional post, put, and delete requests, that's what I would use a server action for. And we can still create route handlers or like API endpoints manually ourselves. But I would use that for webhooks, not for your standard, right, submitting data from a form, right? So these two are really powerful these days in Next.js, right? So if I submit test 2, if I click submit, I again am logging this here in my server-side terminal. All right, now a route like this where users can actually add something to the database, typically you want to protect this, right? So maybe only logged in users should be able to do this, create a post. Right, so we don't want anyone that's not logged in to be able to access this. Right, so only logged in users should be able to access create post, this page. So we need an authentication solution, and I'm a brand ambassador for Kinde. I've really enjoyed working with them so far. It's a paid sponsorship, but this is also what I would use for my own projects. So I would say check it out. They have a very generous free tier. Right, so that's what we're going to use. So we're going to use Kinde, and Kinde actually has a very generous free tier. So if you don't have an account yet, go ahead and start for free here. And then here you can create an account. I already have one. So after you log in to their dashboard, you can add your application here. So we need to add an app. We can add application. So we can say first Next.js project. Next.js is actually more like a backend framework, so we can just save here. All right, so then here we can pick Next.js. They have an SDK for that. All right, so then here we already have a project. So we'll say existing code base. We need to set some callback URLs, just boom, boom. Then we need to install their package. Okay, so I will just open up my terminal here and just paste that right here. Okay, next step is to add some environment variables. So we haven't seen environment variables yet. So whenever you have a secret, like an API key, you don't really want to hard code it, right? So here, if you have some secret API key, right? So something like this, in order perhaps to make a fetch call to some external API, you don't want to hard code it here because you can actually accidentally leak this to the client. So instead, you want to add that as an environment variable, because environment variables, they have some additional protection. So in Next.js, you will often see the convention being here that it's .env.local. And so in here, we can just copy and paste these values. Don't show it to other people. You can see there's actually a secret here. I'm going to delete this after recording. So make sure you keep it a secret. You can also see that the file here is grayed out, right? So here in git ignore, if I scroll down a little bit, you can see I'm not including this as part of my Git repo. So when I push this to GitHub, .env.local will not be included, right? So this should not be included when we push to GitHub a bit later. Okay, let me actually close out of everything here. All right, so next we need to create a so-called API endpoint. So that is actually one of these, right? So this is what kind internally in our app we'll use to wire everything up. So I can actually just copy this path. I can just copy the entire thing. And then here I can just at the root, I can just say new file and just paste that. And my code editor will automatically nest this in the correct place. Then I can just copy and paste this. And that's it for that. All right, so that's actually already enough to get started with Kinde. Now we could add login and logout buttons, register buttons. But as you'll see, we don't even need to do that. So here, when we now go to create post, we want to make sure that only somebody that's logged in can do that. So we need to exclude this page for people that are not logged in. So how do we do that? So there are two options you probably want to consider. So here, this page should be protected. Now, this is running on the server side. So on the server side, Kinde helps you out with this one function. So anywhere on the server side, we can use this function from Kinde. It's called get Kinde server session, and it will give us some things. We can destructure that. But what we are interested in is just whether the user is authenticated. I do need to import it from the correct path here. So this is the import I'm using. And then here, before we return anything, we can check if the user is authenticated, right? So here I can have an if check, and actually is authenticated is a function, is an async function. So we should do await is authenticated. We can call that. We can do it directly here in the if statement. I do need to make this async. Right, so now we're just checking if the user is authenticated. So if that's not the case, I'm going to negate this. So I'm just going to add one more set of parentheses here. So if the user is not authenticated, we can redirect the user. This is also something we can do with Next.js. We can redirect them to, maybe we have a special login page, but here we didn't do that. And actually Kinde will give us a login page. So we just have to pass this to Kinde by sending the user to this API endpoint that we actually created here. Kinde will then take care of the rest. Right, so here we can just redirect to this path. Now, after the user logs in, we can also specify where they should be redirected to, right? So user logs in, we don't want them to go back to the home page, right? So we know they want to access this page. So after login, we want them to go back to create post again. So after this login, we can simply say go to create post. Right, so this is one option we have. So let's see what happens now. If I now go to the home page, I'm not logged in, of course, right? So I have never logged in yet. So now if I try to access this page, So I'm gonna click right now on create post, and you can see it's redirecting me to actually a login page that we don't have to create ourselves. This is something that's managed by Kinde. You can see it's actually on the kinde.com domain as well. Now we can customize this if we want. Now the only thing we do want to add here, of course, is a way for a user to authenticate. So here in the dashboard for the app that we created here under authentication, we can decide the options that the user should have. So email and code, or email and password, username. So actually, let's actually use our GitHub account. So user needs to have a GitHub account to log in. I'm gonna save here. And now I'm gonna go back and try that again. I'm gonna click on create post. Let's see what happens. Now I can log in with my GitHub account. Okay, so I'm actually already logged into GitHub, so it's not going to give me like GitHub. Are you sure you want to log in with GitHub? But if you're not logged in, you will see that screen first. But you can see now I'm logged in. I'm redirected to create post, right? So now we are protecting this page, right? And we also know that because if I inspect here, if I go to application here, I can see I have an access token here, right? A JSON web token. Right, it's outside the scope of this video to talk all about that, but Kinde will check this token to see if you're authenticated or not. So this is one way of doing authentication. We have this function here and you do it in the page component. The other option you have is with middleware. So in Next.js, we also have middleware. So what we can do, let me quickly show you that as well. So here at the root of the source, we can create a middleware.ts file. And here I can add the following, right? So here we can export a function that will be your middleware and you get the incoming request, right? So the way to understand middleware is that as there is a request coming in to your server side and there is some request from the browser to the server side, before it kind of touches anything else on the server, there is middleware first, right? So here we have middleware. Right, now the middleware can already check if the user is authenticated. So before it allows the request to continue, maybe the user is not authenticated for a particular page, right? Page is just a server component. So middleware can already check that. Are you logged in? If the answer is no, it can already send a response back before it sort of touches anything else on the server side, right? So that's what we're doing here with middleware. So the parameter here is a request and actually of type next request. And so I'm going to pass that request to Kinde, right, with auth, which will check if the user has that access token. And then here I can determine which routes it should protect, right? So here we don't have admin. We actually only want this create post to be private. So here we can say run this on the create post route, and everything else will then be still public. So then I can remove it from the individual page, which looks a little bit messy, right? So I actually like using middleware because now we can remove it from here and we have a better overview now with the matcher as well of which routes are protected and which aren't. And there are other benefits with middleware as well. Okay, so I can remove it from here. And now if I try to access create post, I can still access it because we already logged in, if you remember that. So let's actually quickly add a logout button here as well, so we can remove those cookies, right? Those JSON web token is actually in a cookie. So we also want to add a logout link. So we'll add a logout link here. We'll say logout, and I'm importing that from here. Okay. So now we have logout. If I click here, it will delete my access token. If I now inspect, you can see the cookies are cleared. Okay, now if I try to access create post, we should be redirected to the login page again. Yeah, so now I have to log in again and I can log in. And actually after login, it tries to redirect me to dashboard. So we can quickly change that here as well. Because we have an environment variable here that says the default redirect URL should be dashboard. So we may actually want to change it to create post. Depends a bit on what else you want to do with this project. There are also additional options we can do with middleware itself here, but I think you get the point. We can protect our routes like that, right? Create post. So now only logged in users can access this. All right, so that's already a little bit advanced authentication. So well done for making it this far. Now just to finish off this point here, if you remember what we just discussed about these server actions, right? So now with this form, the data is submitted to a server action, right? Which we have here. Now here we're just logging the data, but in the real world, we may actually want to insert it into our database, right? So we would want to do something like this, right? So here, if you're using an ORM like Prisma, you would do something like post.create, something like this, right? So here I would actually insert into the database, right? Pretty cool. And I don't even have to create a whole separate API endpoint. It's just like a sort of like a normal function without all of that setup hassle. Now let's talk a little bit more about our data, right? So our data right now, if we go to, when I say data, I mean essentially these blog posts. These are now all coming from some external third-party API, right? So if I go to one of these, it's coming from this dummy JSON website, right? So this is essentially reading data. We're just getting data, right? So with data, it's always about reading and writing. So here we're reading data, and with this page, what we intend to do in the real world is to write data. However, since we are using some external data source, we cannot just add something to there. So now we're actually going to add our own database, and we're going to get the posts from our own database, and we're also going to add posts to our own database. But before we do that, let's actually fill out this page a little bit better. So we do want to get an additional input here for also the body content of the post. And let's style it a little bit better as well. So let's go to the create post page. It's right here. So we just have one input right now. Now here we could add another input, but there is actually another tag or element in HTML and therefore also in JSX, which is called text area, which is considered more appropriate if you have multiple lines of text. Right, so here we can give it a name of body. We can say body content for new post, body content. We can give it some class name, right? So I'm getting these nice suggestions here from Copilot. Welcome to the age of AI programming. Sometimes I don't even have to think. I can just tap through my code. Let's actually see what this gives me though. Okay, not great yet, but we'll also make it required here. All right, so for the styling, we want the form to flow vertically. Let's actually remove this H10 and let's actually add flexbox, but we want to keep that vertical flow. So we're going to make it flex call and we'll give it a maximum width of 400 pixels. And actually we want to center it horizontally. We can do it with MX Auto. Okay. And then for the input here, we'll say H10 instead of H full. We will actually remove the H full from the text area, because here the way it works is we can specify how many rows it should get. Let's give it 6 rows. Okay, and let's also give the button here at the bottom a height of 10. And for spacing between them, we don't want to use this. We just want to use a gap, which is more common in Flexbox. We'll just say 2, and then we'll add the margin on both top and bottom, so not just top. Okay, and then what we have is this. That looks better. We do need to add some padding here to the text area. So I will just add vertical padding of 2. All right. And actually, I kind of like this logout button now. We could give it a black background color like here, but I like that it's kind of looks like this because it's de-emphasized now more. So maybe let's just keep it like this. So now when I submit this, we still have this one server action, and the browser will take the data from the form and submit it to the server side. So if I open this up, here we are getting the title, right? Form data.get title, because that's the name we gave it here. So it's going to be available on that form data object like that. Here we call it body. So if we want to get the body, we can just write this, right? Just Copilot knows what I want to do. Okay, let me quickly log this to see if we can actually get this on the server side. I'm going to open up my terminal here. And by the way, here what we're doing is we're essentially saying as a string. So this .get method, whatever type this gives us, we are essentially overriding that and we are saying, yeah, it's going to be a string. So you typically don't want to do this in TypeScript. You want to be very careful with, well, overriding types. So this is not ideal. Now in the real world, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but this server action, this input here, we want to do some validation on that, right? So here we are assuming it's going to be form data, but we may want to do some validation to make sure it's actually form data. So we may want to use something called Zod or some other validator, which is outside the scope of this video, would just be a little bit too much. But basically, we're making some assumptions here. just so we can move on and focus on the more important concepts for now. So we'll just continue here. At the end, I'll explain some of the improvements we could make. So I'm logging title and body here. So let's see if we can actually get that here. So this is a title, wonderful blog post. So I'm going to submit here. Let's see if we can get those. Yeah, so here, this is title, wonderful blog post. Okay, so now we have the data on our server side. Now we actually want to insert it into our database, but we don't have a database yet. So let's actually create one. So what we're going to do is we're going to have our Next.js server side is going to interact with our database. So the database is going to be here somewhere. Now, typically you don't interact directly with the database. You use a so-called ORM, right? So maybe I should say ORM. And there are many different ORMs. There is, well, we're going to use Prisma. There's also Drizzle is popular on YouTube. There's also Mongoose, right? Maybe you're coming from the MongoDB world. Mongoose, you probably know Mongoose. It doesn't really matter. They all do something similar, which is they make it much easier for us to deal with our database, right? So we just have to work with Prisma. Prisma actually, well, make sure the database is doing what we want. So we can also set up a database with Prisma. So I'm going to open up another terminal here, or another shell. So here, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger, okay? I'm going to install Prisma as a local dependency. So I'm going to say npm prisma save-dev. So that's the package. Now we do need to initialize it. So it will set some things up. So what we're going to do is npx init. And let me make this a little bit wider, init. And then we can actually pick the data source dash provider. So this is essentially the type of database we want to use. So in the world of databases, there are Postgres, MySQL, SQLite, MongoDB, and they all have their own pros and cons. Now, I like to use SQLite here because SQLite is the easiest to set up. It's just a file essentially here as part of our file system. And I'm getting the sense that SQLite is actually getting more popular. So let's actually pick SQLite here. So make sure you have the same dashes here in the command. I'm going to press enter here. Okay, so once we've run that, now if you take a look at the folder structure, we have some new things here. Let me actually close this. I have now a Prisma folder here with a schema.prisma file, right? So this is essentially configuration for Prisma. And then here we're also going to have the schema of our database. So essentially the tables that we should have in our database, right? So in the world of SQL, it's called tables. And we actually also get this environment variable. So this is something that Prisma uses to connect to our database, right? So here it's reading the database URL environment variable. That's this one here. Now it does not put it in the .env.local file that we already have, where we actually put our Kinde Authentication environment variables. So now we have two files. I think that's a bit messy, so I prefer to use one file. Now, unfortunately, with Prisma, it's a bit difficult to make it work with .env.local. It's easier if we would just use this one .env file. So let's actually copy over everything from here and let's just paste it in here. And then I'm going to delete this .env.local. So now we just have this one, but very important, this is not get ignored by default. So we need to go to .getignore here and we need to make sure we add .env here, right? So if I save here, you can see it gets grayed out. So make sure you add .env here because we actually have secrets in here now, right? So you can see I have some Kinde secrets here. I don't want to expose this on GitHub. Okay, so I can close this now. Okay, so we need to describe how our database should look like, right? So we're going to have a model here for posts. We'll call it model post, just singular. And you can see I actually got a really nice suggestion here from Copilot. I'll just accept here. So typically a post is connected with some author, right? So we're not going to do that here. We're going to remove that. Now our post will need an ID. We will keep that title as well. And here it's called content. That's actually called body. And these two are strings, so we'll keep that. The question mark means it's optional. Well, we don't want it to be optional. It should be mandatory. Okay, so here we could also have publish, right? So we can have many more things here. Now the two other typical things here that you'll see is created at. So we want to keep track of when it was created and usually also when it was updated, right? So here we can have some default values, right? This is essentially how we would like our database to look like, this post collection, this post table. Our database right now does not even exist, right? So this is all Prisma. So now what we can do, if we open up the terminal one more time, we need to create a database. So what we can do is say npx prisma. So whenever you change the schema.prisma and you want to update your database and actually the first time create the database, the command that you probably want to run is npx prisma db push. This will tell Prisma, hey, I updated the schema.prisma, please process the changes I made into the actual database, right? So now you can see some interesting things happened here. It said something about your database is now in sync with the Prisma schema. And actually, since it was the first time that we ran that command, it also created the database. So you can see now the database, if we go to the Prisma folder, has been created right here. You can see it's just like a file, right? So this is our database. Now I cannot see it here. If I actually want to see what's in the database, there's another command. Actually, let me open up one more shell here. I'm going to squeeze in one more. So here I will write on the right side here, npx prisma studio. This allows us to actually inspect what we have in the database. Okay, so you can see it opens up something here. I'm going to close this. I'm going to open this up right here. So this is my database right now. You can see all the models that we have. So we have a post model. So you can see it took this, well, whatever description we gave of that and actually created that in the database. But currently there is nothing in there. There's no actual rows, right? So there is no actual data in the database yet. So let's actually try adding something here. So when you submit the form, how do we actually insert it? So let's see if I go to our actions here. So here we actually already had an example. We actually do want to do something like this, right? Now, when you do this, you're going to get a red squiggly line here because here I'm using Prisma, but we don't have a variable called Prisma here. So how do we actually use Prisma in our code, right? So not just in shell commands, how do we actually use it in code? So you can see I'm getting a red squiggly line here because there is no Prisma variable yet. So we need to instantiate Prisma here in Next.js. So what I like to do is I like to create a lib folder where I can also put things like utilities, but also, for example, a way to set up my database. So here's a db.ts, or basically a way to instantiate Prisma. Now, Prisma recommends that you use some code to instantiate Prisma, or specifically the Prisma client in Next.js. So if you Google for Prisma client Next.js, you will see an article like this. And on here, you will see a code snippet, right? So we can just copy this and just paste that right here. Right, so what this snippet will do is it will use the Prisma client, as it's called. This is what we will actually use to make queries, right? To actually get some data from our database or to actually add some data to our database. Right, so you don't really need to know the details of that. It's a bit advanced. Most front-end developers probably don't know much about that. If you are coming from a back-end background, that's something that you may recognize. But here we are just instantiating that, and it's just going to return this as a global variable essentially. So now we can just close this. And what we can do now is we need to import this variable from that file. Right? So make sure it's that file. And as soon as we do that, we actually get something nice here. What we get actually is type safety. It's one of the benefits of using Prisma, because here I'm only passing in title, but in our schema, we said that there's also going to be a body, and a body is not optional, right? So a body here needs to be in here as well, right? So we can say body, but since it's the same name, we can just leave off. We can just write it like this. Okay, so I'm going to save here. And now if I still have my database open, right? Nothing in my database here yet. So now I'm going to click on submit once again. I'm going to press on submit. Let's actually, I just clicked. Let's see the terminal here. I don't see any errors. Let's actually refresh here in my database. And now you can see I added some data to our database, right? So we now have a way of writing data essentially, right? So reading and writing, we now did the writing. Now what we would like to do is also read the data from the database in our Next.js application. So what we can do here, we can go to posts, and here we are still getting data from that third-party API. Let's actually try getting the data from our own database now. Let's go to that page, posts, and actually we were getting the data in that component itself, right? So we actually need to go to posts list here. So here we were still making that fetch call. We can replace all of this with just a Prisma call. We do need to import it again from that file. We want to get all of the posts, right? So we say prisma.post, and we have type safety here as well, by the way. So if I make a mistake, it's because of that Prisma client that I get a warning here. I can fix my mistake, right? So Prisma will take a look at your models and also generates types based on that, right? So the Prisma client is type safe. Now I can get all the, might find many here. I can also find one specific one, but here I get all the posts, and then let's call it posts. And let's actually map over that so that you can just say posts. All right, so now post, if you hover posts, actually, you can see it's also properly typed. Now, this is one of the benefits of using Prisma. So now here I was manually typing post here, but this is already properly typed for me. So actually we actually need to remove it now. So if I save here and now let's go back to posts here. If I refresh here, let's see what we get. All right, so now we see that one little blog post that we have in our database, and it still has an ID. My ID is generated for us automatically here. You can see that. So if I click on this, it will still go to /1. Okay, because this one has an ID of 1 in the database. Now, for the individual post page, we also should get that individual post from the database, right? So right now we're still getting that from some third-party API. So if we go here, we're still getting the ID. This is still correct. But now we don't want to make this fetch call. We want to get it from our own database. So make sure you actually import it from that file. And again, my Copilot helping me out. So now we can use the find unique method here. And the way it works with Prisma is you say where to specify which specific one. Well, we want to get the post with an ID that is whatever is coming from params. It turns out that this is a string, right? So everything that you're getting from the URL is a string, and this needs to be a number. So we have some parse int, we can use that. Okay, so then we get a response here. Let's actually just call it post because that's what it's going to be. If I hover post, you can see it's again properly typed. Now the only thing is that it's possible that there is some ID in the URL, but I could technically just write some gibberish number here. That's just not gonna match with anything here. So here we do see that the result of this could also be null in this case, right? So what you may actually want to do as well is you can say, if there is no post, we can actually call a special function here also from Next.js not found. And before I explain what that will do, let's actually make this work. So now you can see the red squiggly line here also is gone because now after that if check, it is actually defined. So now if I go here, you can see when I go to, well, ID number 1, we get our post right here, right, with the body here. Right, so very quickly about this not found. So what happens if I now add an ID here that does not exist in the database? If I do this, you can see we get a 404 page by default. Now here, what we can actually also do, there's another special file. Let's quickly do that. It's simply called notfound.tsx. So whatever we return from here will be served when you call that not found function, another built-in, well, handy utility essentially in Next.js. No post found for that ID, let's say. Right, just something here. Okay, so now you can see when I put in some ID here and we can't find anything, we have this. Okay, so we can style this better, but let's leave it for now. Okay, so now we have one post in our database. This is what we have. Let's quickly add another one. So I'm gonna say test 3. I'm gonna press submit. When I check my database now, I can see it's added here. If I go back to posts, I actually don't see it here. Why am I not seeing it here? And the reason is actually caching. So this posts page, let me actually close this terminal here, looks very chaotic. Let me close all of this. So this posts page, when I say page, it's essentially this page component, right? Just a React component. So the result of this component is so-called RSC payload. You don't really need to know that right now. But once it's fetched, once it's loaded essentially here, it's gonna stay there. And the reason is simply so that when you go here and then go back, it's super fast. Now by default, it's cached for something like 30 seconds or some number like that. So now you can see when I come back a little bit later, it actually is here, right? So now I actually see my blog post. But by default, it's not going to make that fetch call every time I go there, because now you can see it's super fast because it's cached. It's only when you refresh that you bust that cache, right? So now it's loading again, or after some time, automatically the cache is gone, right? So caching in Next.js, don't worry about that. I'll have a separate video on that. But now you can see I'm getting all of the blog posts here. Now what we would like to do, of course, is when I create one, let's do another one here, test 4. I'm gonna click on submit right now. I just clicked. When I go to posts now, I would like to see test 4 here immediately. I want to bust that cache immediately after updating the database. Can we do that? And yes, actually we can. So we update the database here in our action here, there's one very powerful function that we can use. We can revalidate, right? So this page here that fetches the component on there fetches it, but it's happening on that page. What we want is that /posts, that all of this is re-rendered again, so that the fetch that happens on this page, well, it's happening in this component, but it's still on this page, that this also runs again, right? So we want to re-render essentially this whole page. So what you can do is we can say revalidatePath. We need to import that, and we can say /posts, right? So /post route should be revalidated. What's essentially going to happen is that this page will re-render, including the data fetch in here, which will get the latest posts from our database, right? So right after updating the database, we are essentially going to get them from the database again, right? So let's actually see if that works. I'm going to quickly create a post, and then I'm quickly going to go back, right? So if I refresh now, you can see this is what we have. If I now, do test 10, let's say test 10. If I click submit and quickly go there, we should see an update there. So I'm going to click on submit now, and now I'm going to go to posts, and now it's going to fetch it again, as you saw. And you can see now here I do have my new post, right? So there are some rough edges maybe that you need to get used to with the revalidation and things like that. But this is pretty cool, I have to say. We don't have to create a separate API endpoint. It's basically just like a JavaScript function that we can invoke, and it will add something to our database, and then we can revalidate the page, and it all just kind of magically works. We don't have to worry about setting up API endpoints. So I think that's very powerful. So now we have a full stack application with database, with both creating data as well as reading the data back here, right? So I can click here and read the data like this. This is very powerful. Now there's one other cool thing I want to show you. So on this page right now, I just hard-coded the form here, right? We could create a separate component out of this. Let's actually quickly do that, and then I'll show you some really cool other feature. Let's just call it form.tsx. I'm just gonna call it form, and I'm just gonna copy all of this markup here, and we will add that right here. We need to import the server action into this file as well. Okay, just for organizational purposes here, we'll create a form. Okay, so here now I have imported that. I can remove this import. So now this looks much cleaner, right? So this is what I would do in the real world. You want to clean up your markup. And now we still have the form here. Okay, so now I want to show you something really cool, which is what if you actually update this on the same page, right? So let's actually also include the form on this page just to show you how this would work. So let's go to that page. That is the all posts page. So let's just actually include the form here as well, right? We can do that. I'm going to include the form here. Okay, so now I have the form here. So now let's actually see what happens if I do test 20, because now we're going to add it to a database, but here we are reading it. So should we then refresh to get the latest data, or what's going to happen? Well, let's take a look. I'm going to press on submit right now. I just clicked, and you can see it automatically updates the view, right? So the UI, right? So when I submit here, it gets added to the database. If I refresh here, you can see it's been added to the database. And then after updating the database, it calls this revalidatePath function, which will re-render this page, including this post list, which will fetch the latest from our database. And that will actually happen in one network round trip. So the result of this render will then be sent here, and it will be shown here in the UI. I don't need to refresh or anything, right? Test 50. If I press submit, I'm just waiting a little bit, and you can see after some time it automatically updates the view as well. I think that's really cool and powerful. So I want to remove the form from this page. This was just an example, and I can delete it here. Okay, and I only want to use the form here. When I submit the form here, right, one last time very quickly, test 100. So this is on a protected page. It's protected by Kinde. If I now click submit, there's still a fetch request, right, to that URL, create post. It's a post request. Now, technically, somebody could just even without the form, just make a fetch call to this URL and make it a post request. Just like with your traditional API endpoints, you do want to protect them, right? So technically it's perhaps possible that somebody can invoke this function even if they're not using it in a form on this page, maybe even just somebody trying to invoke it by just making a fetch call, post call to this URL. So we want to make sure that whoever's invoking this server action is actually authenticated. So anywhere on the server, whether it's in a server component or in a server action, we can use the getKind server session function. Right? The name already says it. You can use it anywhere on the server, and it will give us some information about that incoming request. So we can check if the user is simply authenticated. So what we can do here is we can say if the user is not authenticated, and actually it is a function, so I do need to call it. So let me actually open up another pair of parentheses. So we need to call it like this. So if the user is not authenticated, we will simply redirect them to that API that we set up for Kind. We're just passing off the user to Kind. Kind will manage redirecting to that login page. Right, so one of the first things you want to do here is simply an auth check. Right, so I would consider this a best practice. Right now, on a side note, also because of that, we don't know what we are going to get as the incoming data. Right, somebody could just make a request to this, invoke this server action. We don't know if they're actually going to send form data or some other crazy data. Right, so a more appropriate type would probably be unknown here. And we would want to do something like a validation check here with, for example, Zod. Right? Zod is a popular option these days. So that we know that whatever we're getting here is actually form data, right? So that we actually know we can do .get, right? And we also want to clean up the types here a little bit. This is outside the scope here, but I will just undo it for now. But for a first project, I think this is already good to know. Now we can add many more things here, like an actual loading spinner, clear up the form. And there's so many other little details we can add here, but I think that you get the point. We talked about all of the most important features in Next.js. Now let's say that we like what we have, and now we want to show the rest of the world, right? So we want to deploy it live on the internet. So this is all local. Now we're going to do deployment. So what I like to do is use the other command you have. So we have npm run dev for development server, but we also have this one, npm run build. So this will create an optimized version for production. So npm run build, you can do it locally. I can just run it here. So let's actually see what we get. So we actually get some useful output here. So here, one of the steps is generating static pages. So some of the buzzwords you'll hear often is SSG, static site generation, SSR. That has to do with the following. So by default, Next.js will render each page statically. So that means if I go to this home page that we have, it will run the statements in here. It will produce an output here. It will actually create HTML out of this. So the home page, it will have HTML out of all of this. Right? It's doing that during the build. So then when somebody goes to the home page, that HTML is already there waiting for them. It's already been rendered. We don't have to render as a request is coming in, well, because we can already generate HTML out of it right now during the build. And that's optimal, that's faster, because then everybody that's coming, well, we can already have the HTML on a CDN, for example. So that's very fast. The other option is dynamic rendering. So dynamic rendering means that there is no HTML yet. So when there is an incoming request to the homepage, if it were dynamically rendered, well, then all of this would have to run again. It would have to be computed again for every new request that's coming in. That will be slower, right? So ideally, if it's possible, we want routes to be static, right? So we can already optimize them during the build, and that is actually the default. And you can see here, it will let you know. So here, the home page, you can see it has this circle here, pre-rendered as static content. So the home page already has HTML. By default, it will also create a not found, like a 404 page. We can ignore that. Here we have that API endpoint for Kind. We can ignore that. Here we have our create post page, right? That's actually behind a login for now, is still static. Here we have posts, is also static. And here you can actually see that the dynamic route that we have for all of those individual posts, right? Because, right, so here 1, but it could also be 10 or 50 or 72. There's essentially, well, from Next.js perspective, an unlimited amount of IDs that you can have. And therefore, by default, it cannot statically render all of them, right? So when you have a dynamic route with these square brackets, that will also be dynamically rendered. Right? So it's a dynamic route because it could be anything, but it's also dynamically rendered. So the page.tsx file will run every new request. Right? So I like to run this build because sometimes you accidentally make a route dynamic, right? But that's a topic for another day. I think it's good to be aware of it for now. So we're gonna deploy to Vercel. This is my dashboard in Vercel. I have a project from before. Now here I want to now create a new project here. Okay, now the way Vercel works here, we need to import a Git repository. We can host the Git repository on GitHub or GitLab or other places, but typically it's GitHub. So let's actually push our code to GitHub. I'm going to create a new repo here, and I will say Next.js first project with Kinde for authentication, right? Next.js, right? You can name it whatever you want. I'll make it private actually, and I will create a repository. Okay, so then here we can run a bunch of commands. So here by default, actually, when you use create next app, there is already a Git repository. So I can just say git status. And actually, let me close the other shells here because we don't need those anymore. Right, so I can do git status and it will already work because there is already a Git repo. So I just want to add everything here. And again, make sure that, and actually before you run that, make sure you added .env to your git ignore, right? So it should be grayed out. You don't want to push that to GitHub. So now I added all of that. Now I can just copy these 4 commands and I can just paste them all in one go here. I'll just press enter here. Okay, so it will push that to GitHub. And now if I refresh here, I have my project on GitHub. Right, make sure you do not see .env with secrets in there. So now I can go here to Vercel. Vercel automatically updates here as well. I can just press import. Now, let's actually just deploy to Vercel. We're going to get a couple of errors, but typically when you deploy to production, you're going to get a couple errors. So that's not the end of the world. So for example, we're going to have some issues with the environment variables. But what we can do for now is actually already copy them over. So what you can do here is go to .env. We will need to make Kinde work in production as well. We will leave the database URL for now because we're actually going to use a Vercel database, right? So Vercel is offering databases these days, and they have a better way of connecting. So we don't have to manually do that. Now for Kinde, we're going to use Kinde in production as well. You can see Kinde is now set up for local development because here we have some URLs that point to localhost 3000, right? In production, those need to be different URLs. Now the other ones we will keep. We can copy all of that and paste that in one go here, and you will get this. So this works perfectly fine. So here, these need to point to the production URLs. We don't have a production URL here yet, so we cannot do that. Let's actually deploy so that we can get the URL and then we'll replace them, right? So this may take a couple of, well, actually usually it's like a minute or so. Yeah, you're gonna get a couple errors typically, so. Okay, so here we go. We have the first error, and let's see what this is about. So here we have an issue with Prisma. Okay, so it's not really Prisma's fault, but so typically when you deploy like this, you're gonna have 2 main issues here. So the first issue will usually be with your database. And the second thing we want to pay attention to is any third parties. We want to make sure that Kinde also works in production. Okay, so let's take care of the database issue very quickly. So we can see that Prisma here, the Prisma auto generation isn't triggered. Okay, so this is actually easy to solve. So basically what happens is during development, as we change our model, we run npx prisma db push, which updates the so-called Prisma client. Why is that important? Because that's what we use here to actually interact with our database. This also makes sure it's type safe, right? So this is the Prisma client. Now in production, we do not run npx db push, right? So the Prisma client isn't updated. So what we need to do is we need to go to package.json here, and we can say after the install of the packages, we want to do Prisma generate. Yeah, so this is the command that we want to run to make that work. Now, before we push again, there's going to be another issue here with the database, which is that we are using SQLite here. So SQLite here, you can see it's essentially just a file in our file system. But when we deploy it to Vercel, Vercel creates a bunch of serverless functions, as they're called. So there is not really a persistent file system like that. And therefore, you cannot use SQLite here on Vercel like this. So what we want to do here, let's see if our project is already created. Yeah, so our project is right here. So I'm going to go here. There is a tab here, storage. So you can actually create a database on Vercel. So here we can create a Postgres database for production. So let's actually create this one. On the hobby plan, you can create one free database. So I will accept here, and I will accept the default settings here, create, and I will connect this project. This is important because it will set the environment variables, right? So now in production, our project here, this is still my project here. Okay, now it will also show some ways to connect to this database. So here it shows us how to connect to that database with Prisma. So it actually is a Postgres database. And what we have right now is a SQLite database. So this needs to be different in production. Now to have a nice setup with a local database and a production database, I will have a separate video. It's outside the scope here. So just to keep it a little bit simple, we're just going to copy this and we're going to connect to our database, to our production database also during development. Right? This is not something you want to do typically, but for a simple setup like this, it will demonstrate how everything works. So we're not going to use SQLite. SQLite was just easier to set up. We're going to use Postgres because that's what we're using in production on Vercel. Right? So we can actually delete this dev.db file. We can delete this. And here you can see it's looking for Postgres Prisma URL. So if you want to connect to that locally, you do need to have that environment variable as well. So here we were still using the SQLite environment variable. So we need these other environment variables as well. Right? So we can actually just copy all of these and also paste them here. Actually, we can just delete this entire thing. Just paste all of this. These are all environment variables for my production database. We're also connecting to that locally now. It's just a bit easier to do it that way, right? Typically not what you want to do in a professional setup, but for learning, this is easier. Okay, so now this should also work locally. And these environment variables now are also set automatically in production when you connect your project to this database, which we did during the setup of the database. So let's actually try this again. We're gonna say, well, we can just do git status. Let's add everything. I will just quickly save here. I mean, we can have a nice commit message, right? We can talk much more about Git and other things, but let's keep it a bit simple here. And then I'm gonna push to the origin, which is on GitHub, and Vercel automatically picks up on that. So if we go to Vercel now, let's take a look here to our project. So a project will have deployment. So every time you change something, there will be a new deployment. So here in the deployments, you can see it automatically picks up on that and it will try to build again. All right, so we have another issue, no problem. Let's see what the issue is. Okay, so the table public.post does not exist. Right, so we created a database now on Vercel, but it's just empty. It doesn't have any tables or anything like that. So during the build, as Next.js will actually try to pre-generate HTML out of some pages, as we saw. It will actually already run these page files during the build. So for example, here on the post list, it will actually already run this prisma.post find many, but there is nothing called post in the database yet in production. If you want to update your database according to the schema, we saw that during development, you can do db push, right? This is the quick and dirty way of doing that. The more professional way is to work with migrations. It's outside the scope here. So we can do db push. Again, not really recommended to do this for a production database, but again, this is just learning here. Okay, so now our database is in sync with our Prisma schema. So now if we go to our database, how can I even see my database here? Well, you can just go to storage here, and here we see our database. And then if you go down here, we have data. If I now click on his, you can see there's now a post table, okay? So now we just need to re-trigger that deployment. We don't need to push because the code didn't change. We just need to redeploy again. So if we go to our project to deployments, here you can also just redeploy and then here redeploy. Right, so a little bit of setup here. You just need to do it a couple times and then you'll have a sense for the things that break and how to fix them. So don't worry if this is a bit confusing. All right, finally we see a green light, third time's the charm. And now if I go to visit, we will see our project here, but we're not there yet, but at least we can see this. If I go here, it will actually show me all the posts, but the production database is empty, right? So we don't have anything there. Now, if I go to the other page, we will see something like this because Kinde is still set up for local development, right? So we have fixed the database issue essentially. Now we need to fix the authentication part, right? So we also need to make Kinde production ready. So now we have a URL for our project here. It's this app. It's this URL. I can just copy that. And we need to go to our environment variables for this project. So it's under settings, right? So the hierarchy here is your project, and then here you have your project, and then individual deployments, but this is just the project. And here we want to go to environment variables. And here we have a bunch of variables, database, and then also for Kinde here. So if you remember, these last three all had localhost. So we just need to change that here in production to the production URL, right? Which is this one. I will include HTTPS as well. Right, so here I will just copy this. I will save this and then edit this one. I will also save that here. Okay, and also this one here. I do want to keep /create post. So I will save that. All right, so that's all here for Vercel. Now in the Kinde dashboard, we also quickly want to add something here. So here, allowed callback URLs. This is essentially for security, so that the URLs that the user is actually redirected to are actually approved by us. So here, instead of localhost 3000, we also want to add this one, right? So in addition, we want to have the production URL here as well. Okay, and then here as well. Okay, so that should be it. I'm gonna save here. Okay, so now we can deploy one more time, and let's go to deployments here. I'm going to redeploy this one more time, and then we will see what happens. Okay, so we get a green light again. Let's check it out. Okay, so now I have my homepage here. Posts still works, and let's go to create post here. Let's see if that login screen actually works. And actually, I was still logged in. Right, so it will actually see that my token is still valid. So at least we can see the page. Let's actually log out and see if that works. Okay, log out works good. Now if I do create post, let's see if we can, yeah, so now we get a nice login screen here on the Kinde website. So I'm gonna continue here with GitHub, and Kinde knows where to redirect me, so that should work as well. Yeah, so now everything is working here. Let's actually double check that the database is working. So let's say, hello everyone, very nice blog post. Okay, I'm gonna submit here. Okay, so let's see if that works. So we can go to posts now, and it should get it from the database. All right, so then we have our post there. If I click on the posts, you can see I'm getting to the individual blog post as well. Now, initially it may be a little bit slow. So let's try it one more time. Test 2. I will press submit. Now I will go to post, and I see test 2 here as well. Okay. So everything seems to be working. We have deployed a full stack Next.js application with database, with authentication, with Kinde. So this is already beyond, right? So don't worry if you're a little bit confused. It's totally normal. There's a lot of new paradigms in the latest Next.js, and we can make it much more sophisticated than this. But I would say for a first project, now you have a pretty decent sense of how everything fits together. Right, so I want to thank Kinde for sponsoring this video, and I want to thank you for watching the video. And then I hope to see the next one.